"Daddy, please help me." The desperate voice of the 8-year-old girl echoed on her cell phone before the line dropped abruptly. Industrial Marcus Wellington almost overthrew the phone, his hands shaking as he tried to call back. Nothing, only the busy tone that sounded like a death sentence. In Beacon Hill's luxurious mansion, 10 of the best Boston detectives moved like ants in a destroyed anthill. Police cars blocked the whole street, their headlights cutting the fog at dawn in October. Little Emma Wellington had disappeared during the family's birthday party, and now, 6 hours later, the first contact of the kidnappers had arrived. "Mr. Wellington, we need it to keep calm," said Detective Harrison, a 50-year-old man with gray hair and 3 decades of experience in hijacking cases. "Our team is tracking the call. We have the best experts working on it." Marcus Wellington, real estate tygical with a $200 million fortune, walked nervously through the living room. His wife Jennifer was sedated in the room, unable to deal with the reality that her only daughter had simply gone from her own home during a party with 40 guests. The irony was cruel. The mansion had more security cameras than a federal bank, armed security guards patrolling the perimeter and military alarm system. Even so, someone had managed to take Emma without a single detectable trail. "Do cameras show something?" Marcus asked for the 10th time. "We are analyzing each frame," replied to Detective Sarah Chen, specialist in technological crimes. "But it's strange. There is a system failure between 3:47 p.m. and 4:23 p.m., exactly 36 minutes without recording." In the corner of the room, almost invisible among all the police chaos, Eduardo Santillan discreetly cleaned the coffee tables, gathering glasses and dishes of the interrupted party. At 45, Filipino worked as a residential building's night porter 12 years ago, but had been hired as an extra waiter for Wellington Corporation's birthday party. Eduardo watched every movement, every conversation, every detail that the police discussed. Her dark eyes and attentive eyes captured information she mentally archived, a habit developed for years working for Boston's rich. They talked about him as if they were furniture, revealing secrets, plans, and frustrations without realizing that anyone was always listening. "Who had access to the security room?" asked Harrison. "Just me, my wife, and James, our personal security boss," replied Wellington, "and perhaps some of the employees of the outsourced security company." Eduardo stopped cleaning for a second. He knew something no one had mentioned yet. During the party, he had seen James Morrison, the security boss, talking intensely on the phone near the security room. The conversation looked tense, almost aggressive, and Morrison had looked several times toward the upstairs, where Emma played with the other children. But who would pay attention to the observation of a Filipino waiter with curious eyes? "Eduardo," called Mrs. Wellington, down the stairs with the red eyes of crying. "Please prepare a strong coffee for the detectives. They will need energy to find our Emma." "Yes, ma'am," Eduardo responded in his accent loaded with an accent, bending respectfully. No one suspected that before emigrating to the United States, Eduardo had been a criminal investigator in the Philippines for 15 years, specializing in cases of kidnapping and extortion. While preparing coffee in the kitchen, Eduardo reflected on the small details he had noticed during the party. The way Morrison constantly checked the cell phone, the whispered conversation he had with an unknown man near the garden, and especially that strange moment when Morrison insisted on accompanying Eduardo to the parking lot to check safety shortly before Emma's disappearance. What was most intrigued Eduardo was the fact that Morrison disappeared exactly when the first police arrived. He claimed to have gone to check out the external perimeter, but Eduardo was sure he saw his car out of the lateral entrance of the property. Detectives were so focused on complex organized crime theories and international kidnapping that they did not pay attention to simple details. Eduardo knew that the smartest criminals are precisely those who hide in sight of everyone, using positions of trust to perform plans that would seem impossible for strangers. There, serving coffee for the researchers who treated their presence as part of the decoration, Eduardo made a decision that would change the direction of that case. If the police couldn't see what was right in front of them, it was time to simple Filipino doormen show how crimes really happen when no one is paying attention. 3 hours earlier, during the height of the party, Eduardo had noticed something that none of the guests realized. Morrison was too nervous for someone responsible for the safety of a family party. His hands shake when he checked his cell phone, and he exuded excessively despite the air conditioner. But what really caught the attention of Eduardo was when Morrison practically dragged an unknown man for a reserved conversation at the back of the garden. The man was clearly outside the profile of the guests. Visible tattoos on the neck, poorly made beard, and a nervousness that brutally contrasted with the elite environment. Eduardo, trained for 15 years to identify suspicious behaviors, immediately activated his camera discreetly and photographed the exchange of something between Morrison and the strange. In the photo, Captured through the kitchen windows, it was possible to see Morrison delivering an envelope to the man, who in return showed something on his phone. Morrison's expression at that moment was those who were sealing a very dangerous deal. Eduardo always carried his cell phone with a cover that allowed to photograph without anyone noticing, a habit developed during his years as a researcher in the Philippines. At that time, he had solved dozens of kidnapping cases, many involving internal betrayals and complicity of people close to the victims. "Mr. Morrison is not feeling well?" Eduardo had asked innocently when the security boss returned from the mysterious conversation, his red eyes and hands still shaking. "Only tired, Eduardo. Long party," Morrison answered sharply, avoiding eye contact. "And you didn't see anything, you know? Focus on your work." The veiled threat did not go unnoticed. Eduardo simply nodded, keeping his usual submissive posture but mentally archiving every detail of the interaction. Morrison clearly did not expect a simple Filipino waiter to have a criminal analysis capacity, or that he was paying attention to something beyond cleaning tables. Now, serving coffee for detectives that discussed elaborate theories about international organized crime, Eduardo watched Morrison being treated as a collaborative witness, not a suspect. The head of security provided information about protection systems, family routines, and possible vulnerability points of the property, assuming the role of worried expert. "Sir, are you sure you don't want me to be to help with security?" Morrison asked Wellington, his almost convincing loyalty performance. "I can coordinate with the police, review all cameras again." "James, you've done more than enough," said Wellington, clearly grateful. "Go home, rest. We'll need you in the coming days." Eduardo almost dropped the coffee tray. Morrison was being dismissed just when her presence would be more necessary to keep the facade. This only reinforced the suspicion that he needed to distance himself before some compromising detail emerged. While the detectives continued to analyze external cameras' recordings and elaborating psychological profiles of professional kidnappers, Eduardo knew that the answer was literally in his hands. The photo on his cell phone not only showed the suspicious transaction, but also clearly captured the face of the unknown man, and the exact moment when Morrison delivered what could be the initial payment of the kidnapping. What no one there was suspicious was that Eduardo was not just an observant doorman, but someone who had dedicated 15 years of his life to understand exactly how crimes like this work. He knew that kidnappers rarely act alone in houses with military safety, and always need someone with internal access to provide information on routines, security systems, and moments of vulnerability. There, serving coffee for the researchers who treated their presence as part of the furniture, Eduardo made a decision that would change the direction of that case forever. If the cops couldn't see what was right in front of their eyes, perhaps it was time for a simple Philippine porter to show how crimes are really solved when anyone knows exactly where to look. What no one knew still was that Eduardo kept on his cell phone not only a compromising photo, but also 15 years of experience in identical cases. But first, he needed to decide if it was worth revealing his true identity and risking his comfortably invisible life he had built to save a child whose parents didn't even know what kind of expert was serving coffee in his living room. If this story of mystery and injustice aroused your curiosity, be sure to subscribe in the channel to find out how a simple immigrant doorman has managed to solve what 10 expert detectives have failed, and why sometimes the most important answers come from those who everyone underestimate. At 3 a.m., while detectives still debated theories about international organized crime, Eduardo watched a scene that confirmed their worst suspicions. Morrison had returned to the mansion claiming that she forgot some important keys to security, but her behavior was completely different from the previous performance of a worried man. "I need to review some protocols in my office," Morrison told Detective Harrison, avoiding direct eye contact. "It may be that I let some detail pass on the family routines." Eduardo, who was cleaning the corridor near the security office, noticed that Morrison was not looking for keys or documents. "I was deleting files on the computer." The characteristic sound of the frantic clicks on the keyboard and the blue light reflecting on his sweaty face revealed someone erasing evidence, not looking for information. When Morrison realized that Eduardo was around, his concern mask slid for a second, revealing an expression of pure irritation and contempt. "Are you still here? Don't you have a home to go?" Morrison asked with aggressiveness that completely contrasted with his previous posture. "Or are you waiting for them to pay extra time to see where you don't?" Eduardo kept his usual submissive posture, slightly lowering his head. "Sorry, sir. Just finishing the cleaning. Mrs. Wellington asked to leave everything organized for when Emma returns." Morrison laughed cruelly. "Poor. Still believes in happy endings, right? Some children simply disappear, especially when families do not collaborate properly with the demands." The coldness of that comment froze Eduardo's blood. Morrison was clearly referring to some kind of negotiation that had not yet been made public. This meant Emma was still alive, but Morrison had information about the kidnapping she wasn't sharing with the police. Eduardo pretended not to understand the implication, assuming a confused expression typical of those who do not completely dominate English. "Lord, I don't understand very well." "Of course you don't understand," Morrison replied with disdain. "Return to your brooms and leaves the subjects important for those who have brain for it." At that moment, Eduardo made a risky decision. He discreetly activated the recorder of his cell phone, a habit he had developed during his years as a researcher in the Philippines. If Morrison was involved, eventually slipping and would reveal something compromising. "Mr. Morrison," Eduardo said with his humblest voice, "do you think Emma will come back soon? Mrs. Wellington is very sad." Morrison stopped typing and looked straight at Eduardo, her eyes revealing cruelty that could no longer hide completely. "Do you know what your problem is, immigrants?" Morrison said, her voice, laden voice. "They think they can understand complex issues just because they can clean the bathrooms and serve coffee. Emma comes back when her father learns to value what really matters. And that doesn't include the opinions of Philippine porters." Eduardo continued to recording silently as Morrison continued to delete files. Through the screen reflected in the window, Eduardo was able to see that Morrison was specifically erasing the party day access logs, eliminating any evidence of those who had entered and left the security room. "Do you know that the cameras have been down for exactly 36 minutes today?" Eduardo asked innocently, as if it were just an employee curiosity. Morrison froze. It was the first time Eduardo showed attention to technical details of the investigation. "How do you know that?" Morrison asked, his voice now loaded with suspicion. "I listened to the cops talking," Eduardo answered quickly. "I found it strange. Systems so expensive, right? How can you fail just when—" "Electronic systems fail, idiot," Morrison interrupted sharply. "Not inventing conspiracy theory just because you watch a lot of movie." But Eduardo had noticed something crucial. Morrison showed no surprise with information about the 36 minutes. An innocent person would ask details, would be shocked with the coincidence, would question how it was possible. Morrison reacted as someone who already knew exactly what had happened. At that moment, Eduardo realized that he was dealing with someone much more dangerous than he had imagined. Morrison was not just a fellow receiving money to make it easier to kidnap. He was in charge of the operation, using his trusting position to orchestrate everything from inside his own home. During its 15 years as investigated criminal in the Philippines, Eduardo had seen dozens of similar cases. Elite kidnappings always involved internal betrayal, someone close to the family who knew routines, security systems, and moments of vulnerability. What made him more furious was seeing Morrison playing the role of worried victim, while an 8-year-old was in danger because of his greed. Eduardo knew he needed to act quickly. Morrison was clearly preparing to disappear before evidence compromised him. The recording was a good start, but he needed more concrete evidence before revealing his suspicions to the detectives that treated him as furniture. As he pretended to organize his cleaning materials, Eduardo mentally cataloged everything he had observed. The transaction with the mysterious man, the 36 minutes of fault in the cameras, the deletion of access logs, the comments about Emma not coming back if the father did not collaborate, and especially Morrison's reaction to knowing that Eduardo was paying attention to details of the investigation. Morrison finished deleting the files and stood up abruptly. "I hope not to see you stirring where you shouldn't," said, his voice loaded with a bad threat disguised. "Immigrants who get in dangerous matters sometimes have problems with immigration. It would be a shame for you to lose your job because of excessive curiosity." The threat was clear: to be quiet or to face deportation. Morrison was counting on the typical fear of immigrant workers to keep Eduardo silenced. What he didn't know was that he was threatening a former criminal investigator who had faced much more dangerous drug cartels and criminal organizations. Eduardo nodded submissively, but inside his determination solidified. Morrison had made the classic error of completely underestimating his opponent. It was now a matter of time until its arrogance turned against him. What Morrison could not imagine was that every word of contempt, every veiled threat was being recorded, and that Eduardo had already identified enough standards to locate Emma. But first, he needed to find a way to make detectives pay attention to what a simple Philippine porter had discovered as they pursued sophisticated theories about the perfect crime that was going on under their noses. At 4 a.m., Eduardo made a decision that would change everything. While the detectives were still chasing false clues about international organized crime, he silently photographed Morrison's computer screen, showing the deleted logs. More importantly, he had memorized the license plate number he saw leaving the property exactly when Morrison claimed to be checking the perimeter. During a breakfast break, Eduardo discreetly approached Detective Sarah Chen, the specialist in technological crimes that seemed more open to listening to different perspectives. "Excuse me, Detective," Eduardo said softly, keeping his posture respectful. "Can I talk to you a minute? It's about something I've seen during the party." Chen looked at him with expression of those who did not expect relevant contributions from a cleaning employee, but her vocational education prevented her from dismissing him immediately. "Of course, you can say. I saw Mr. Morrison talking to a strange man in the garden. Man didn't seem normal, invited. Then Mr. Morrison was very nervous, sweating a lot." Eduardo deliberately intensified his accent to seem less threatening and more naive. "Are you sure of that?" Chen asked, now paying more attention. Eduardo discreetly showed the photo on his cell phone. "I managed to take a picture. Look here, Mr. Morrison delivering something to man." Chen took the phone and widened the image. His expression changed completely when he saw the clear transaction between Morrison and the unknown. "My God, Eduardo, aren't you? You need to show this immediately to Detective Harrison." "But I'm afraid," Eduardo answered, pretending to hesitation. "Mr. Morrison already told me not to put myself where I shouldn't. Told about problems with immigration if I talk too much." Chen immediately understood implication. Morrison was using deportation threats to silence the only witness to her betrayal. "Eduardo, you are protected as a witness. No one can threaten you for cooperating with a police investigation. Let's talk to Harrison right now." 5 minutes later, the investigation dynamics had changed completely. Detective Harrison analyzed Eduardo's photo with an expression of those who finally found the guiding thread he was looking for. "This man in the photo, we have been able to identify it through the databases. Vincent Parker, 3 kidnapping and extortion passages, last times working with internal partners." Eduardo felt a discreet satisfaction to see the detectives connecting the points he already had identified hours before, but there was more information that needed to reveal gradually, not to raise suspicions about his true expertise level. "Detective," Eduardo continued cautiously, "there's one more thing. Mr. Morrison came back here after you arrived. I said you forgot Chavez, but I saw him messing with the security computer. I was deleting something." Harrison and Chen exchanged significant looks. Morrison had lied about not having returned to the mansion, and now there was evidence that she tried to destroy evidence. "Eduardo, what do you remember? What time exactly Morrison left the property the first time?" "Around 4:15 p.m. I saw his car out of the side entrance, the one that has no camera. I found it strange because Emma disappeared around 4 p.m., didn't she?" Harrison was impressed by the level of attention to Eduardo's details. "You have good memory for schedules. In my country, I needed to be very observant to work safely," Eduardo replied, letting a small track over his past without revealing everything. "Life there teaches you how to pay attention to details that other people don't see." Chen was quickly reviewing Morrison's testimonials. He said he was on the property all the time during the kidnapping. This time discrepancy is crucial. What Eduardo did not reveal was that he had already mentally tracked the most likely route Morrison would use to transport Emma. During his 15 years as a researcher in the Philippines, he had learned that kidnappers with internal access rarely take victims far in the first stage, preferring nearby hiding places where they can maintain control of the situation. At that moment, Morrison's cell phone rang. Eduardo, who was close enough to hear, realized it was the same touch he had heard during the party, moments before Morrison became visibly agitated. "Harrison," Morrison answered, his tense voice. "Yes, I'm still here." "No news yet." "What?" "No, there has been no contact of the kidnappers since the first call." Eduardo noticed something crucial. Morrison lied. There was a second contact from the kidnappers, but he was intercepting communications before they arrived at the Wellington family. This meant that Morrison had full control of the operation and was manipulating both the kidnappers and the family. After Morrison hangs up, Eduardo approached Chen with another, innocent observation. "Detective, can I ask one thing? Wellington family received more calls from kidnappers?" "No, just the first." "Why?" "It's just that I heard Mr. Morrison talking on the phone now. He said there was no contact since the first call." "It seems strange to me to say that, right?" Chen frowned. "What do you mean, weird?" "Well," Eduardo said, pretending confusion, "if there was no contacts, why would he need to confirm this? Is it as if someone was asking other contacts that should have happened?" The insight of this observation impressed Chen. Eduardo was identifying linguistic inconsistencies that indicated Morrison's privileged knowledge of communications that officially did not exist. "Eduardo, have you worked with investigations before? Your observations are very accurate." "No, detective, I only watch a lot of police movie," Eduardo responded with a modest smile. "And when you get invisible like me, you learn to listen to things that important people say." At that moment, Eduardo realized that Chen was beginning to suspect that there was more behind his seemingly casual observations. He needed to be more careful not to reveal his true expertise prematurely. Eduardo's cell phone vibrated discreetly. It was a text message from an unknown number. "Stop asking questions or your migratory situation will complicate quickly." Eduardo showed the message to Chen, who immediately was alert. "This is a direct threat of witness. Eduardo, you are officially under police protection from now on." Morrison, who was watching the conversation at a distance, realized that something had changed in the dynamics of the investigation. His eyes found Eduardo's, and for the first time there was a spark of genuine concern in his expression. Eduardo kept his stance submissive, but internally smiled. Morrison was finally beginning to realize that he had drastically underestimated the simple Philippine porter. Each threat, each attempt to intimidate was just providing more evidence for its own conviction. What Morrison could not imagine was that Eduardo had already identified his participation in the kidnapping, but also the most likely location where Emma was being maintained. During his years investigating similar cases, Eduardo had learned that criminals like Morrison always follow predictable standards, especially Q. They believe they are smarter than everyone around them. It was now just a matter of time before Morrison's arrogance turned completely against him, and Eduardo was preparing each movement with the accuracy of someone who had spent 15 years transforming underestimation into Vittoria. At 5:30 a.m., Eduardo made the decision that would change everything. It was time to stop pretending to be just an observant doorman and reveal who it really was. "Detective Chen," Eduardo said, his voice now stripped of the exaggerated accent and submissive stance. "We need to talk. My name is Eduardo Santillan, and I was a criminal investigator of the Manila Kidnapping Division for 15 years. The transformation was instantaneous. His posture straightened, his eyes gained professional intensity, and his way of speaking has completely changed. Chen was gaping. "I know exactly where Emma Wellington is being maintained, and I have enough evidence to condemn Morrison for kidnapping, extortion, and conspiracy." Eduardo pulled his cell phone and began reproducing the recordings he had collected. Morrison's voice clearly echoed, "Some children simply disappear, especially when families do not collaborate properly with the demands." "Jesus Christ," murmured Harrison, who had approached hearing the conversation. "Did you record it all?" "This is just the beginning," Eduardo replied, showing the sequence of photos of the transaction with Vincent Parker. "Morrison is not just an accomplice, he is the brain of the operation. During my years investigating similar cases, I learned that elite kidnappers always need internal access. Morrison had everything: access to security systems, knowledge of family routines, and the full confidence of the family." Eduardo began to explain his analysis with the precision of an expert. The 36 minutes of fault in the cameras were not accidental. Morrison programmed it remotely. He deleted the logs because they would show that he deactivated the system exactly when Emma was taken. Chen was quickly reviewing all the evidence. "Why didn't you reveal that before? Why did I need irrefutable evidence? A Filipino porter accusing the American security boss without solid evidence? You would never have believed." Eduardo smiled ironically. "Besides, Morrison was buried deeper and deeper with every threat she made me." At that moment, Morrison's cell phone rang again. Eduardo got a gesture for everyone to be silent and activated the speaker mode of his own phone, revealing that he had hacked Morrison's line hours earlier. "Is everything under control?" he asked an unknown voice. "For now," said Morrison, visibly nervous. "But there is a problem. That Philippine is asking many questions. We may have to silence it permanently. Do whatever is needed. We cannot risk that the operation be compromised when we are so close to payment." Eduardo hung up the recording and looked at the astonished detectives. "There is your complete confession of conspiracy for kidnapping and death threat." Harrison was pale. "How could you hack his phone?" "Philippines researchers need to be creative with limited resources. I learned some unconventional techniques for my 15 years in the department." Eduardo then revealed his final analysis. "Based on the standard of movement and calls I intercepted, Emma is being kept in an industrial deposit about 20 minutes from here. The address is 2847 Boulevard Industrial. Morrison chose this place because it is the property of a sheet company he created 6 months ago." "How did you discover that?" Chen asked, impressed. "I recognize the standard. Hijackers like Morrison always maintain victims initially close to maintain control. In addition, I identified facade companies recently created in the name of Morrison family members through public records." At that moment, Morrison entered the room, not knowing that his call had been intercepted. Seeing all the detectives gathered around Eduardo, with serious expressions, his concern mask began to slip. "Any news?" Morrison asked, trying to keep the composure. "Yes, James," Harrison replied, getting up. "Many news." Eduardo directed directly to Morrison, now without any trace of submission. "James Morrison, you are stuck in Emma Wellington's kidnapping, extortion, death threats, and criminal conspiracy. Morrison paled. What are you talking about? This waiter is inventing. Former criminal investigator Chief Eduardo Santillan, an expert in kidnapping cases, Eduardo corrected, showing his original Philippine credential. And I have 15 years of experience identifying criminals just like you. Eduardo started play the recordings one by one. With each audio, Morrison's face was becoming more desperate. When he arrived at the last recording where Morrison admitted to being so close to payment, Morrison tried to run toward the door. 2 police officers intercepted him immediately. Don't move! You're stuck! This is a frame! Morrison shouted, his voice now laden with panic. Are you going to believe an illegal immigrant against an American citizen? Eduardo smiled coldly. Legal immigrant for 12 years with valid green card and international credentials in criminal investigation. And unlike you, I never threatened to kill a child for money. Harrison took the phone to coordinate the rescue operation. Tactical units for 2847 Boulevard Industrial. Possible victim of kidnapping on site. Morrison was being handcuffed when he looked straight at Eduardo, his arrogance finally replaced by absolute despair. Like you, a simple porter. I was never a simple porter, James. I just let you think this while collecting enough evidence to destroy you completely, Eduardo answered calmly. You underestimated the wrong person. 15 minutes later, the police radio crackled with the news that everyone expected. Victim located and rescued. Emma Wellington is safe and being transported to the hospital for medical examinations. The relief that took over the mansion was palpable. Marcus Wellington fell to his knees, crying in gratitude, while Jennifer ran to prepare to receive her daughter. Morrison was being taken handcuffed when she made her last desperate attempt. You don't know who you're messing with. I have connections. Dear lawyers, you'll regret having gotten it. Eduardo looked at him with the serenity of someone who had seen dozens of criminals being arrested. James, the only thing I regret is not having revealed my identity earlier. Maybe Emma had not spent so many hours in captivity. Chen approached Eduardo. Why did you really work as a porter here in the United States? Eduardo smiled sadly. My youngest daughter has a rare disease that requires continuous medical treatment. Researcher salaries in the Philippines were not enough to cover the costs. I came here to build a better life for my family, accepting any honest work, and he eventually saved another child in the process, Harrison observed with genuine admiration. People like Morrison have our invisibility, Eduardo explained. They see us like furniture, unable to complex reasoning or precise observation. This arrogance always knocks them down at the end. When Emma finally arrived at the mansion, running to her parents' arms, Eduardo watched the distance meeting. His satisfaction did not come from the fall of Morrison, but from the restored justice and a complete family. Morrison had lost not only his freedom, but his reputation, career, and any chance of escape. Eduardo's evidence was so comprehensive that even the best lawyers could save him from a significant conviction. But for Eduardo, the real victory was in the proof that competence and integrity always surpass arrogance and prejudice, especially when someone totally underestimated who is facing. 6 months later, Eduardo Santillan was walking through the corridors of the Boston Police Department, no longer as an invisible porter, but as an expert consultant in kidnapping cases. His table was on the same floor of the detectives that once treated him as a furniture, and now they were regularly looking for him for insight into complex cases. The transformation had been surreal. The police department, impressed by its resolution of the Wellington case, officially hired Eduardo as a specialized consultant, recognizing his Philippine credentials and offering a salary 3 times larger than the porter. His unique criminal investigation experience combined with his ability to move unnoticed in elite environments has become a valuable asset. Eduardo, we have a new case of kidnapping in Brookline. Rich family, internal security, no obvious clue, said Detective Chen, now his official partner in high-profile cases. Does it look familiar? Eduardo smiled with the irony. Let me guess. All suspects are family members or external employees, but are no one investigating trusted internal employees. Exactly. Can you start tomorrow? Meanwhile, Morrison had a 25-year sentence for kidnapping, extortion, and criminal conspiracy. Eduardo's evidence had been so comprehensive that even the best criminal lawyers were able to negotiate a smaller deal. Morrison has lost not only his freedom, but also his home, pension, and any chance of professional rehabilitation in the area of security. The which most destroyed Morrison was finding that he had been completely deceived by someone who considered intellectually inferior. During the trial, when he learned of Eduardo's true profession, Morrison had an emotional collapse in front of the jury, repeatedly shouting that it was not possible that a simple immigrant had destroyed his career. The Wellington family not only expressed eternal gratitude to Eduardo, but also established an educational background for children of immigrants wishing to pursue careers in law enforcement. Marcus Wellington, impressed by Eduardo's competence, offered him a position as security director in his company that Eduardo politely refused to continue helping the police. "Eduardo saved my daughter when 10 experts failed," Wellington said at a news conference. "He proved that competence has no nationality, and that sometimes the most valuable people are exactly those we have learned to ignore." Emma Wellington, now completely recovered from trauma, had developed a special friendship with Eduardo. During occasional visits to the mansion for security consulting, she always went to greet him, calling him Uncle Eduardo, the detective that saved me. The case had become a reference study at the local police academy about the importance of not underestimating witnesses based on social status or ethnic origin. Eduardo was invited to give lectures on unconventional research techniques and how to use social invisibility as an investigative advantage. "The most dangerous thing for a criminal," Eduardo explained to cadets, "is to believe that he is smarter than everyone." Morrison made the classic error. He confused social position with intellectual capacity. In personal life, the transformation was also dramatic. With the new salary, Eduardo managed to bring his family from the Philippines to Boston. His youngest daughter finally had access to medical treatment she needed, and her other daughters were enrolled in excellent schools. His wife, also a former police officer in the Philippines, managed to validate his credentials and was hired as a researcher by the same department. The ironic was that Eduardo now worked in the same building where he once cleaned bathrooms as an emergency night porter. Some administrative staff still remembered him, but now they treated him with professional respect. The difference was not in him, which had always been competent, but in the perception that others had of their value. During a departmental meeting, Eduardo found some of the detectives who had initially ignored their observations in the Wellington case. "Eduardo, I need to admit," said Detective Harrison, "I completely underestimate you that night. Not just your skills, but especially our own arrogance by ignoring someone based on appearance. The most important lesson," Eduardo answered diplomatically, "is that competence exists in unexpected places. You are not bad people. You were only trained by a system that teaches you how to value credentials more than results." Chen, who had become a vocal defender of diverse investigative perspectives, often cited the Wellington case in professional conferences. "Eduardo has taught us that the best researchers are sometimes those that society trains to be invisible. They see standards we lose because they observe without prior judgment." A year after the case, Eduardo received a letter in prison. It was from Morrison, trying a last desperate manipulation. "Eduardo, you were completely wrong. I thought it was just a dumb immigrant, but you are smarter, I imagined. Maybe we can work together when I get out of prison. You teach me your techniques. I teach you about American security systems." Eduardo showed the letter to Chen, who laughed incredulously. "He still doesn't understand that he has nothing to offer you. Morrison still believes that her American experience is worth more than my international experience," Eduardo noted. "This arrogance is exactly what has always knocked it down." Eduardo ruled out the letter without responding. Morrison had lost everything: freedom, career, reputation, family, because he underestimated someone based on superficial prejudice. The best revenge had simply been to allow Morrison to reveal his own incompetence through his arrogance. In the end, Morrison had tried to use prejudice as a weapon against Eduardo, but eventually destroyed himself. Eduardo has learned that true revenge is not to return the damage suffered, but to achieve the success that their enemies could never imagine. Sitting in his new office overlooking the city of Boston, Eduardo reflected on the surreal journey of recent months, of an invisible porter to a respected consultant, from immigrant threatened to specialize as sought. The transformation had not changed who he was, only publicly revealed what he had always been. The biggest victory, Eduardo thought, while reviewing a new complex case, was not destroying Morrison, but proving that competence transcends prejudice, and that sometimes the most qualified person to solve a problem is exactly the one that no one would expect. Have you already underestimated someone based on appearances? Has it been unfairly underestimated? Leave in the comments how you dealt with situations where your skills were ignored. Subscribe to the channel for more stories that show how intelligence and perseverance always surpass arrogance and prejudice, especially when someone makes the fatal mistake of underestimating who is really facing.